to officially welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is titled Community Destruction in Extreme Wildfires, a Home Ignition Problem. And it's brought to you today by Pepperwood, and our presenter is Jack Cohen. And before we get started, I just have a few slides to introduce you to Pepperwood if you've not had a chance to be there before. Again, my name is Margaret Boger. I'm the Education Director up at Pepperwood. And our mission at Pepperwood, which you can see here in the slide, is to inspire conservation through science. And although we're not sitting at Pepperwood today, you can see a picture of it also behind me, we do want to acknowledge that Pepperwood Preserve sits within the traditional homeland of the Wapo people, and we respect and honor past, present, and future generations of Wapo and their continued connection to this land. We're grateful for the opportunity to gather in this beautiful place and to give our respect for its first inhabitants. And this land acknowledgement statement was written by our Indigenous Education Coordinator and the chair of our Native Advisory Council, Clint McKay, who is Dry Creek, Pomo, Wapo, and Wintun. And this is a map that shows you the topographical configuration of Pepperwood, which is about 5 square miles in northeast Santa Rosa, 3,200 acres, and Pepperwood is home to over 900 species of different plants and animals. And here also in this picture to the left, you can see the facility that we call the Dwight Center for Conservation Science. It's named after Pepperwood Foundation's founders, Herb and Jane Dwight. And this is where we have most of our research and administrative and course offerings. We hope that you'll be able to make it up there someday. And I invite you to explore our website and also some of our social media channels at the end to see how you can come up for one of our classes and hikes in the near future. Pepperwood has 3 core program areas: research, education, and community. The research that we do up there studies ecosystems for long-term management and stewardship of land, water, and wildlife. And we also study a lot of climate and post-fire recovery work. Our education programs, of which you are a part of one today, includes different webinars, field trips for kids, overnights, retreats, classes, and hikes. And we encourage you to come up and see us in person. Many of our offerings are free. And then also the community component is our 3rd core, and that consists of donors, funders, volunteers. The 2nd Saturday of every month, we have volunteer work days, which you can see pictured here. And community is a really integral part of how we are able to do our work. So we thank you for being part of Pepperwood's community today. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to pass it over to Rob Gross, who's a retired field biologist. He's done a variety of all kinds of different work, including mountain lion research and fire research. And he currently serves as a wildfire mitigation specialist. And he's joining us from Middleton, California today. He's going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Jack Cohen. Rob?
Hey, thanks, Margaret. And before we get to all the accolades for Jack, I want to give you guys a little background on how we got here. Well, besides living on Pepperwood years ago, we ended up in Middletown 15, 16 years ago. A series of fires, starting with the Valley Fire in 2015, were pretty terrorizing. We were told our house had burned, and I'd never been through the evac like that before. So it was a little distressing, honestly. Then there was a series that followed that, almost one big one every year. The largest one, the ranch, and it ended up then the Paradise and the car and all these overwhelmed me. I turned to the Forest Service trying to get some information and come up with Jack Cohen, who apparently was working down at the fire lab when I was doing a contract down there. And he's the guy. And so I contacted the guy, Jack, in Missoula. Son of a gun, he was in his office. I got right through to him. It worked well. He got me oriented. I learned a lot from him. That was 6 years ago. I kept learning and learning. He kept throwing more information to me that was really useful. So I became a wildfire mitigation specialist. I studied and trained with NFPA and did that. Now I can reach out and it all makes sense to me. So I'm here to share it with the community. And I think what Jack's message is, his life mission, is to help people understand there's a lot that they can do themselves. You don't have to rely on the fire department because they're spread awful darn thin in these major blazes. Listen to Jack and he'll make sense and show you how to help yourself. I want to say special thanks up at the fire lab to Joe Crawford. She was very special to me. She helped me navigate a lot of the politics and things at the lab, which was really helpful. She helped me gather more information with Jack's help there too. So all that behind us, I want to give Jack a little time here. Jack is a research physical scientist. For me, that's an interesting one because I'm a biologist. I look on the live side. He looks on the physical side, which is interesting. He's the guy. He's the technical leader, established the radiant heat barriers with the crown fires and came up with a home ignition zone and comes up with a lot of practical applications for homeowners. And if the decision makers and the policy makers would listen, they could save a lot of homes and a lot of lives in a passive fashion. And I think Jack has that here. He's received a lot of accolades over the years. Association of State Foresters, U.S. Forest Service has recognized him, International European Union, National Fire Prevention Association, and International Association of the Fire Chiefs. Jack has earned his keep. He was a line firefighter, hot shot on the lines, ate smoke for a while, became a researcher, still touches close, keeps close to fire, and his research shows it. There's something that we can all learn from Jack today. There's something that we can all learn from Jack today, and that is to save ourselves and our homes. I'm tired of going through evacuations. I'm well enough terrorized. I now understand fire well enough with Jack's input. I don't have to fear it all the time, only when the red flags are up. So Jack, I thank you, and I hope everybody listens and gathers stuff. So with that, Dr. Cohen, thank you for being here on the last of the 5 speaker series you've done. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. So we'll, without further ado, we'll get going. I'm going to start and at this particular point, I'm going to cancel myself out of the screen. Good, perfect. So what I'm going to be talking about in this next hour, roughly this next hour, is how community fire destruction occurs during extreme wildfires, and then with that define the problem of community destruction, particularly disastrous community destruction, numerous homes destroyed, being a home ignition problem. So this is the kind of scene that I class as a disastrous event. It's, I mean, with the recognition that anybody's house that burns is going to be a disaster. So what I'm looking at is essentially the large disasters, the multiple disastrous community destruction. And I call that the wildland-urban fire disaster, the many homes and businesses that burn to total destruction. So in order to effectively manage wildland fire and to prevent wildland-urban fire disasters, what I want you to understand is that there is more to the wildland fire context than just homes burning during the wildfire. We need to look at wildfire occurrence, wildland fire occurrence, as both a natural disturbance, an appropriate ecological process, and as a natural hazard. We tend to focus on the natural hazard because it initiates community burning, and we tend not to know about or ignore fire as an appropriate ecological occurrence. So let's take a look at fire as an ecological occurrence. So the first premise is wildland fire occurrence is inevitable, whether it's from lightning or whether it's from human cause, it's inevitable. We also need to recognize that North American ecosystems, with very few exceptions, developed with and were maintained by fire, ignited mostly by humans as well as lightning. And this has been going on since humans were here and in various parts of the country when the climate changed from having ice caps where I live here in Montana, as well as the climate changing all the way through North America. So as that climate changed with humans here as well as lightning, there was fire in the development of these ecosystems as an ecological process, as a selective process. And because of the influence of humans lighting fires, our indigenous peoples, that means that human ignitions and humans are part of that natural development of these ecosystems. So one of the things that I want to emphasize here is not focusing on cause of the ignition, but rather the results of the ignition, the results of the fire that occurs from that ignition. Well, so our current occurrence of fire is considerably different than what it was before European settlement. So starting with disease depopulation and the subjugation of Native Americans on this continent, European settlement, along with agriculture, urban development, and over the last little over 100 years, modern attempts at fire exclusion, we have greatly reduced and changed the occurrence of wildland fire. So specifically over roughly the last 100 years, 100 years, wildfire suppression has largely kept 98% of fires small and has largely eliminated the historical ecological currents of wildland fire and its influence. And a portion of that 2% of wildfires that escape initial attack become extreme under the most severe conditions, which is actually less than 1% of the occurrences. And what this has developed into, particularly our intense attempt at wildfire exclusion, we have inadvertently increased the potential for extreme wildfire conditions over extensive areas. And this is when wildland urban fire disasters occur. It's these extreme wildfire conditions that are associated with a disastrous community destruction. So let's take a look at wildland fire now as a natural hazard, what we tend to focus on. So this has historically occurred, particularly in the US, in the continental US. So let's look at 1870 to 1990. Historians call this period the Great Barbecue, Steve Pine in particular. This is when mostly very large fires, very high influence on the societies that were living there. Interestingly enough, in 1871, the Peshtigo fire, burning over 1 million acres in the Lake States, primarily in Wisconsin, occurred on the very same day under the very same weather influences as the well-known Great Chicago Fire. And during this period, over 2,000 civilian fatalities occurred and numerous entire towns and villages were destroyed. Now, the interesting thing about this is we might hear, well, fire suppression didn't have anything to do with these huge fires in the Lake States and elsewhere. So what's this fire suppression thing? Well, but we need to recognize that in this particular case, there was a huge amount of slash and burn agriculture as well as timber harvesting the extraction of wood products that left an enormous amount of vegetative debris. And it was this debris that was over large areas of the lake states that generated the high intensity fires. Well, between 1920 and 1984, we also, to a lesser extent, have the same kinds of events occurring. We had less than 100 civilian fatalities in this case. Over now, with the advent of fire suppression, 400 or more firefighter burnover fatalities, and 5,000, a little greater than 5,000 homes destroyed. So in 1985, this is a demarcation point in this issue, because it was in 1985, primarily the spring to fall of 1985, that 1,400 homes, little more than that, were destroyed primarily in Florida, North Carolina, and California. And it motivated the National Wildland-Urban Interface Initiative. It was an initiative of federal, state, and local agencies, and it generated programs such as Firewise, Fire Adapted Communities, and other programs. So let's take a look at what this national recognition has done to influence the disaster occurrence since 1985. Well, let's take a look at this isn't a complete list necessarily, but it is a list starting in 1990 up to roughly last year. So we can see that we have had many of the disasters of home destruction between 999 homes destroyed. Interestingly enough, when we start looking at 1,000 or more homes destroyed, we can see that particularly with California and one other location in the Smoky Mountain, in the Appalachians, we have a significant increase in the number of homes destroyed during an event. And interestingly enough, when we look at 2018, which was primarily the Carr, Camp, and Woolsey fires, we see that the destruction of homes, this is homes, not just structures, 16,000 homes destroyed, when the national total for the 10 years between 1985 and 1994 was 9,000. Well, so the bottom line of my point here is that the national attention that started in 1985, that increased suppression resources and federal, state, and local collaborations, have not effectively abated the increasing trend of wildland-urban fire disasters. So what we've done with increased fire suppression capability is largely to continue the wildfire paradox. Our national focus on wildfire as a natural hazard, with suppression as the principal response, particularly for community protection, has continued fire largely not occurring as an appropriate ecological factor, particularly in the Western US, and communities largely are not becoming ignition resistant to extreme wildfire exposures, and hence we have increasing wildland-urban fire disasters. So this brings us to a puzzle, to a conundrum. How can we have appropriate wildland fire as an ecological factor without having wildland-urban fire disasters? So given that wildfires are inevitable, there is no trend in our history to indicate otherwise, and thus we're going to have extreme wildfires that are inevitable? Does this mean that wildland urban fire disasters are inevitable? And my response to this is no. It is not inevitable to burn up our communities during wildfires. So given current best available science for understanding how homes ignite, wildland urban fire destruction during an extreme wildfire is a readily preventable human disaster. So what I mean by that, I'm now calling it a human disaster, not a natural disaster. And the reason for that is because we have the ability to prevent the destruction, the human disaster, during the occurrence of wildfire as a hazard. And most importantly, we have the ability to take our communities out of being a problem for having wildland fire as an appropriate ecological occurrence. So fire science reveals opportunities for preventing wildland urban fire disasters without necessarily controlling extreme wildfires, which we by and large can't do anyway. Well, so the notion of not necessarily having to control wildfire in order to prevent the wildland urban fire disaster is not something I think we generally conceive of in our society. So the question is the ability to prevent wildland urban fire disasters without controlling wildfires consistent with what we perceive as how wildland urban fire disasters occur? Well, let's take a look at a few samples of media interviews to indicate what our perceptions are. The firestorm descended like a dragon from hell on the foothill neighborhoods and laid them to waste. The wildfire swept through the community with a tsunami of flame. The wildfire literally exploded houses in flames, leaving destruction in its path. It was like a war zone. Well, so let's take a look at Paradise. So a few days after this scene was available via internet, I was getting questions principally from journalists to the tune of, can you explain the unusual pattern of destruction? It's interesting to me that it took drone footage, high definition drone images, in order for us to see what is typical of the pattern of destruction, which was my response to their question. We're looking at total home destruction without the tree canopies burning. So when we look at a scene like this, people see what they believe and ignore the rest. We see this as being the result of a tsunami of superheated gases that lays this whole community to waste. We see something from the outside coming in and victimizing without any ability to change the results. And we tend not to see the canopy, the green unconsumed canopy surrounding this destroyed community. The typical patterns of wildland urban fire destruction do not support this perception of walls of flame sweeping through communities. And wildfires don't literally explode houses into flames. So when we look at a scene like this is from the Laguna Fire in 1993, we see a lone house surviving without protection. There was no protection in here, primarily because of overwhelming exposure and burning of homes, and it was a severe life safety hazard. So this house became known as the Miracle House. But when we look at the scene, what else didn't burn in this community? And by the way, The wildland is way back at the top of this scene. Through the haze of smoke, that's where the chaparral, the Southern California chaparral was that supported the wildfire. Most of this picture, most of this image is suburban Laguna. So when we look at this scene as to what else didn't burn, we see, yeah, miracle vegetation. So these homes are burning without the participation of fire in the chaparral. These homes ignited from lofted burning embers, not from wildfire flames. Now, as it turns out, both of these homes were highly vulnerable to burning ember ignitions. They had flammable wood roofs. In this particular case, it wasn't flammable wood roofs. This is Los Alamos, more than a block inside the community. And by and large, what we're looking at here are burning embers igniting surface material, vegetation litter that contacted the house for destruction. And when we look at this scene, these two houses, they're side by side. They were contacted by low intensity surface fire that burned with low enough intensity. Notice the wood rail fence in the behind this home, and this burned from a surface fire, low intensity, making contact with the home several hours after the high intensity wildfire spread past the community, not to the community. Let's take a look and see what this looks like, this very block, what it looks like when it was burning. So here we are in Los Alamos, homes burning hours after the wildfire passed the community. Intense wildfire never spread to this residential area. And the houses are burning, and we're looking at that through unburned, not burning tree canopies. In this particular case, we're looking at low intensity surface fire spreading continuously to make contact with flammables on site sufficient to ignite the house sustainably. This is a different location. This is what it looks like. Typically, home ignitions result from lofted burning embers, from low intensity surface fire spreading to contact the structure, either ignited from the wildfire that never reaches this area, or due to lofted burning embers generating what we call spot fires that then can spread to the home, across roads, over other kinds of obstructions. So when we look at unconsumed tree canopies amid the total destruction of homes, this indicates that wildfire flames did not spread through the community. Burning trees did not ignite these homes, and the trees that were consumed adjacent to and over the destroyed homes, what is now the destroyed homes, ignited from the burning homes. We can take a look at Australia. This is the 2009 Melbourne fires. This is Kings Lake, and we see the same scene. Eucalyptus canopies, various species of eucalyptus, unconsumed, with total destruction of homes. Napa, 2017, the oaks in the background did not consume. The Carr Fire, 2018, burning embers ignited the home without any high intensity wildfire. And last year in 2020, the same kind of pattern, total destruction surrounded by unconsumed tree canopies. So commonly communities burned by fire spreading through residential fuels, the vegetation and structures. within the community are spreading the fire. These homes, as well as all of the other disasters that I've dealt with, where 100 or more homes have been destroyed, ignited and burned hours after significant wildfire activity has ceased, either at the community edge or the wildfire got to the community, other than by burning embers. The community continues to burn without a wildfire exposure. The wildfire certainly initiates ignitions within the community, which is an important factor of the wildfire. The wildfire can, with burning embers, can expose and initiate ignitions in numerous simultaneous, overwhelming kinds of exposure. So let's take a look. This is somewhat ironic for me because this is the Angora fire, and you're looking at homes in the lower right corner in South Lake Tahoe. And interestingly enough, at least for me, in 2021, the Calder fire is actually crossing this area considerably to the south, to the far left, out of scene of this exact neighborhood. So the intense wildfire is spreading up Angora Creek at about 2:30 in the afternoon. And by the way, where the arrows are pointing down towards the community, that's where fire off of the flank of the intense wildfire spread on the surface through a fuel treatment to contact the first houses on the wildland side of the community that ignited and then spread fire throughout the community between 3:30 and 5 in the afternoon. So, what do unconsumed vegetation and homes adjacent to total destruction indicate to us? It indicates that wildfire does not spread through the community like a lava flow, a flash flood, or a tsunami that explodes houses in flame, leaving total destruction in its wake. Intense simultaneous heating across wide areas of structures does not occur. And this is an extremely important point in how it is that we homeowners have a huge amount of leverage in changing the conditions required for ignitions on our house very locally to our house. It's the local conditions that determine home ignitions. It's us, our authority, and as it turns out, matching responsibility that can readily change those conditions to eliminate home ignitions. So when we see a scene like this, total destruction does not indicate high intensity wildfire exposure. These homes ignited and freely burned to total destruction because there weren't firefighters available to extinguish small ignitions. It's not because they wouldn't, it was because they couldn't. They weren't available. In this particular case, we have several thousand houses exposed to a wildfire with on the order of initially about 100 responding engine units. So although initiated largely by burning embers from intense wildfires, burning residential fuels, the homes and the associated vegetation continue the fire spreading within the community. So now let's step back and look at how it is that it is the local conditions that determine the ignitions on our homes that we mostly care about. So when we look at an intense wildfire like this, it spreads because it meets the requirements for combustion. The fuel, heat, and oxygen insufficiency can then produce ignitions and sustain those ignitions. And thus, fire occurs by meeting these requirements for combustion. And they meet right at the surface of the fuel. That means fire is a process. It's not a thing. And if we interrupt the process, then we don't have fire. And we can be quite assured that where post-fire we see it burned, indeed it met the requirements for combustion. And immediately adjacent to that, where it didn't burn, we know that the process halted for whatever reason. So wildfire spreads when ignition requirements are met at adjacent fuel during wildfires, including these extreme wildfires. So one step at a time, iterating time after time, even in conditions like this, it is a process. The requirements for combustion occur at the fuel surface. Fire is not a thing that travels from place to place like tsunamis, floods, and other natural hazards. It is not an earthquake. It is not something that moves from a disturbance out there that travels to here. It is a process. If that process can't continue, we don't have fire. And that provides us with opportunities to prevent wildland-urban fire disasters. That's how it is that we can look at big flames out there that aren't capable of igniting a fire over here and make those big flames that impress us completely ineffective as a natural hazard. Well, when we're talking about wildland-urban fire, when we're talking about communities initiating and burning during a wildland fire, it's not a wildfire problem. It's a home ignition problem. And because of that, now the fuel are the homes and the heat is all the burning materials, including burning embers, on and adjacent to the homes, and oxygen is always plentiful in this particular context. So now we want to look at our homes as potential fuel. And when we want to do a fuel treatment, that means getting our homes ignition resistant. And what that also means is that geographic classifications, the term interface and intermix, do not determine home ignitions. It's a process. The home ignitions are occurring due to the conditions right at the surface of the fuel. It's not a relationship between where the community is and where the vegetation is. Of course, there's an association there, but the ignitions are not determined by that geographic association. The ignitions are determined by the requirements for combustion and the conditions that satisfy those requirements. And that's what we have control over, which is good news because it's not likely that we're going to start moving our suburban and exurban communities into the city center. So it's about the requirements for combustion, initiating communities burning, and therefore I call this the wildland-urban fire problem, not with an interface, not with the idea that somehow or another we can geographically classify and, more importantly, geographically solve this problem. So, in this case, local conditions were not sufficient for ignition, where we have obviously high intensity burning surrounding this house, which the house did not meet the conditions required for combustion. And in this particular case, we see largely no intense burning, no tree canopy involved, and we see total destruction of the house. So that raises the question of how far is local? and what conditions principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. So this is where a great deal of the research that I did comes into play. And the results of the modeling that I did, the physical modeling, the experiments, both laboratory as well as field experiments, and the examinations of post-fire as well as during fire examinations of the wildland-urban fire situation. That's what I did, and the characteristics that I found, the results of that research indicated that the characteristics of a home in relation to burning materials in the immediate surroundings within just 100 feet principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. Well, so let me clarify. That 100 feet is looking at flames. It's looking at the flame front. It's looking at this idea that if we've got big flames that are further away than 100 feet from the house, we can't meet the requirements for combustion on the wood of that house. And when I was doing this research, particularly the modeling and the experiments, the resulting 100 feet was an intended overestimate. I don't want to underestimate the bridge load. I don't want to underestimate that distance. Now I'm scaling essentially where we're going to do our ignition resistance work. Well, so how can 100 feet be an overestimate? Well, how would we know? Because our perceptions of fire are through what affects us. And as it turns out, our human skin sensitivity to thermal pain and injury is much greater than the heating requirements for piloted wood ignition. That is, that's an ignition where I start heating up the wood, it decomposes to produce flammable vapors. Those flammable vapors mix with the oxygen in the air. And then with a small spark or small flame, I can ignite that flammable mixture. Well, so let's get an idea about what causes us pain and injury compared to what it takes in order to ignite wood. For example, a flame radiative exposure that produces a second-degree burn on my exposed skin in 5 seconds takes over 27 minutes to ignite a wood wall. Well, 27 minutes is a huge amount of time for a fire burning, particularly a wildfire of high intensity burning at a single location, which only takes on the order of less than a minute at a particular location, which means that if it doesn't continue to ignite something adjacent to those big flames, then it goes out. And that means that our human perception of ignition requirements is not reliable for judging the ignitability of our home. So I'm going to give an example here that's related to flames, not burning embers. We'll get to burning embers in a moment. So here I am on an incident in Southern California. I was talking with the strike team leader of an engine crew, of an engine strike team, and his comment was, well, when this area to the left started to burn intensely, we had to disengage because of life safety. And by the way, the area to the left of the fellow on the street was Manzanita, and it burned to ground level. So it produced high intensities, indeed, high intensities. People can't be there between the high intensity fire and the community. We see an aerial view, and in our examination, we found that the house, the destroyed structure, was more than 100 feet from the most intense, the largest flames that occurred. And there was a surviving wood fence, a split rail fence that we'll see in a moment, that was about 45 feet from that location. And when we look closer at this surviving fence, we don't even see any thermal degradation, no char. We see scorched leaves, but the scorched leaves occur from the same exposure, the same sensitivity as what produces a second-degree burn on our exposed skin. So interestingly enough, the flames could not have ignited that house. Indeed, it was a life safety issue, an injury issue, but it wasn't an ignition issue. So we have the opportunity to reduce fuels within 100 feet of a home, to discontinue intense fire spread, to prevent ignitions from intense radiant heating, and prevent surface fire flames from contacting the home, potentially to ignite it, without necessarily controlling the wildfire. It's clear that we didn't control the wildfire around this surviving house. So home ignitions during extreme wildfires are principally determined by the ignition characteristics of a home in relation to the burning objects within 100 feet of the home. And this has come to be known as the home ignition zone. Here's an example. It's not a model for, we don't necessarily require everybody's home to look like this, but the effect has to be the same. So what's the effect? Well, so we have intense crown fire spreading across this slope, and we had insufficient flame heating and a home that was ignition resistant from burning embers such that it's sustained. It didn't ignite sustainably. Well, but typically extreme wildfires don't spread into developed neighborhoods. So when we look at this situation, we see there was an intense crown fire. This was on June 18th, by the way, of 2002, in an area that is generally called Heber Overgard in Arizona. The houses on the right side of the residential street were essentially inside the crown fire. But interestingly enough, 40 feet from canopy to canopy across this street could not ignite the tree canopies. And yet, for another 2.5 blocks to the state highway, there was total destruction without crown fire. Why? There was a blizzard of burning embers coming out of this crown fire, starting at a distance and then increasing to the edge. So this is what I'm talking about. This kind of close range burning ember exposure. And here we're on the Woolsey fire, a couple of guys on a deck, and it is absolute chaos with burning embers. But note, perhaps I need to go back, they are not mortally threatened by burning embers. And so as a result, we tend to, as people, we tend to pay attention to the things that cause us pain and injury. And granted, burning embers are not a wonderful experience, but we don't perceive burning embers as a mortal threat to us. We tend to focus on the big flames. Burning embers are inevitable during extreme wildfires, and burning embers come beyond the home ignition zone, that 100 feet from the house. Embers commonly ignite structures and vegetation within communities at distances of a ½ mile or more during extreme wildfire conditions. And this, of course, varies depending on the type of vegetation. If it's large woody vegetation with flammable canopies, it's going to produce high velocity flames that strip off burning material and cast it in severe winds downwind to ignite burning ember fires, spot fires. So, but regardless of the distance lofted from the wildfire, burning embers only generate home ignitions at locations of accumulation. It doesn't get any more local than burning embers directly on the home on debris that is deposited on the home. So let's take a look at demonstrations that I was involved in. I was a collaborator with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, where we did demonstrations and experiments using burning ember generators on a home. So here's our full-size home inside our research center. We have pine needles in the rain gutters that are plastic PVC gutters. We have aluminum gutters and another PVC length. We have pine needle debris in the roof valley of a fiberglass asphalt composition shingle covered roof, pine needle mulch at the front, bark mulch on the side, vinyl siding, fiber cement, composition board, fiber composition board. Here we have the demonstration. We have ember exposure. This is a representation of the intensity that you can have from close range burning ember exposures. And notice, without any flame exposure on this house, we've got flame contact on the structure due to the very close proximity of debris, flammable debris, pine needles at the base, immediately beginning, initially igniting and contacting the structure. We've got fire starting in the gutters, and we get fire in the valley debris of the home. This is real time. This isn't, what we're looking at here is an area where we, the homeowners, have sole authority over having it or not having it. We have flame contact on this structure due to the debris, not due to big flames. Note that we have the plastic gutters falling out onto the surface. Now, interestingly enough, it's the burning on the left side of the house in that re-entrant corner that becomes the sustained ignition on this house, not on the composition shingle roof. And we ended up suppressing this because our goal here is not to burn houses down inside the facility, it's to look at how ignitions can occur due to debris and a intense burning ember exposure. Well, so residential fuels, the burning structures and adjacent vegetation, once it begins within a community, the burning structures and adjacent vegetation become significant sources of embers that continue community fire spread hours after significant wildfire exposures. So this is the last day in Southern California during the Cedar Fire, 2003. In the early morning, this ember exposure is from 2 houses burning. And it gives us an idea the kind of ember exposure that can be experienced without a wildfire. So wildland urban fire disasters do not occur from a tsunami of flames sweeping through the community. Houses don't literally explode in flames. It indeed is not a war zone. And dragons from hell aren't to blame. So how do wildland urban fire disasters occur? Well, let's start with severe fire conditions. Strong winds, low relative humidity, sufficient fuels to produce severe intensities, extreme intensities that overwhelm fire suppression, and of course the topographic effects. Then we get an ignition. So given an ignition under those conditions, or having an ignition and then those conditions developing, we end up with extreme fire behavior, rapid fire spread, and or high intensities. Then, given that we have development, we've got a community that can be exposed, we end up that is vulnerable to ignition. We have multiple simultaneous ignitions that overwhelm our fire protection resources. We've already not been able to suppress the wildfire to prevent the exposure within the community. And now we have multiple initiation of ignitions within the community that overwhelms our fire protection, which means that there are many homes that have ignited and are burning without any fire protection available for suppression. And we have multiple free burning houses to total destruction. The disaster occurs. So wildland urban fire disasters have only occurred during extreme wildfire conditions when wildfire suppression was ineffective and structure fire protection was overwhelmed. Again, it's not that we wouldn't protect the houses, it's we couldn't protect the houses because of the overwhelming exposure and burning. Well, so what's our current approach to preventing wildland urban fire disasters? These are the tools of wildfire suppression. And this fails to prevent wildland urban fire disasters during extreme wildland urban fire conditions. When the conditions become extreme, escaping our initial attack, rapidly spreading with high intensities, this fails. The inevitability of extreme wildfire conditions and our inability to control extreme wildfires suggests inevitable wildland urban fire disasters. However, the home ignition zone ignition conditions primarily determine home ignitions during the extreme wildfires. That area of the home in relation to its immediate surroundings within roughly 100 feet determines the conditions for home ignition. That's where we do our fuel treatment in order to keep the homes from burning. So total destruction commonly starts with small number ignitions on and adjacent to the home that can be readily prevented. So when we go back to the disaster sequence, what we're going to look at here is the extreme wildfire, but now we have eliminated the home ignitions, or more realistically, we have eliminated many of the ignition vulnerabilities, thus eliminating many of the potential ignitions or ignitions. And then those that do occur, because we can't fireproof our houses, the houses we live in, by and large, we can't fireproof them, but we can make it such that the tactical task of protecting the community then comes into parity with the number of fires that occur that we have to extinguish. And so we're not overwhelmed in our protection. Many homes are now protected, many more than would be protected otherwise, and we prevent the disaster. So the prevention of the wildland urban fire disaster is not about controlling extreme wildfire, which we can't do. It's about a much smaller task and much more readily available task of reducing home ignition. We can make homes and communities ignition resistant by eliminating and reducing ignition factors within the home ignition zone. Wildland urban fire is a home ignition problem, not a problem of controlling extreme wildfire. We can make homes ignition resistant during extreme wildfires by eliminating ignitions from flames within the home ignition zone and reducing ember ignitions of the home. So remember, home ignitions during extreme wildfires are a local combustion process determined by local conditions within the home ignition zone. It's not an interface, an intermix, or other geographic classification. And home ignition resistant homes do not have flammable debris on the home and its flammable attachments. They do not have any ignitable material within 5 feet of the home and its flammable attachments. There is no flame contact from within the home ignition zone. We can easily eliminate high intensity burning within the home ignition zone, and burning embers become the only ignition mechanism of wildfire home exposure. So what about building codes? Well, we need to be careful when we think about building codes, because our current building codes, now granted, we've got California 7A, and I won't get into, well, primarily because I haven't been involved in 7A for many years, but we need to be careful that the codes actually are appropriate and effective for the context, for the conditions of the wildfire exposure. And commonly our fire codes designate fire performance rather than ignition performance. So the materials and designs of a fire performance code slow flame spread with their ratings, such as extended time wall, ceiling, and door fire penetration hour ratings. And many of our fire codes assume that we're going to have protection. And those codes won't help prevent wildland urban fire disasters. So fire performance codes that facilitate fire control by reducing interior fire involvement rates assume a firefighter response. But remember, during the wildland urban fire with multiple homes, many homes simultaneously having an initiation of ignition, having a simultaneous exposure over large areas, we have reduced fire protection capability. So those homes that are vulnerable require mitigation of the things that ignite the vulnerabilities that occur related to a wildfire exposure, not related necessarily to our common fire coding. So without protection from firefighters or residents, any sustained ignition results in a total destruction. Home ignition resistance during extreme wildfires increases ignition performance and eliminates most ignitions. So we need codes appropriate for wildland urban, so that wildland urban fire can be beneficially mitigated. So how do we code pine needles in gutters, firewood on the deck, and flammable material under the deck? So let's take a look at an example where codes might be highly effective with regard to wildland urban fire. That is the urban conflagration in high density development that happens to initiate from a wildfire. So now we're talking about structure to structure ignitions where we have very small clearance from structure to structure. In this particular case, I'm using Coffey Park as an example, where we have very high density, we have very minimal property line setbacks between houses. And in this particular case, we can potentially code not only for wildfire, but also for any fire occurrence that might occur in a neighborhood like this, we can begin to, from a materials and design standpoint, have non-flammable materials covering the house, certainly between structures, from structure to structure, such as common materials like fiber cement siding, facing board, trim boards, and boxing panels. This is a situation of extreme overlapping home ignition zones where the physics of ignition doesn't change, but certainly the social dynamics becomes critical. Without having a cooperative community, and by the way, codes and regulations tend to mandate that social dynamic that is responsible for your neighbor, they become critical. So making our homes ignition resistant means having wildfires without wildland urban fire disasters. Thank you. So, I am ready.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jack, for such a fabulous presentation. And I'm just looking in the chat here. There were some questions about whether or not folks could share this out with their friends. And of course they can. I put in the Q&A that yes, indeed, we have recorded today's presentation and we'll get it up on the Pepperwood Preserve YouTube channel for distribution to anyone you think might be interested in this, hopefully within the next couple of days. And so with that, here's one last opportunity. If you want to ask any questions, please put them in the chat. And while you're doing that, let's see. I wanted to invite those of you who have stuck around to the end of the presentation to come up to Pepperwood for one of our next upcoming events. We actually have a public hike this Saturday, September 11th, where we'll be doing the Bio Blitz at Pepperwood as well as part of the California Biodiversity Day. We also have a watercolors class coming up on September 18th, a geology class, which is a two-part. We've got a virtual class on Thursday night, followed up by a field portion on Saturday, September 25th. We have an Oaks class on October 2nd, taught by Steve Barnhart, who used to be the education director here at Pepperwood. And then finally, we have a wild writing workshop coming up on October 23rd. And these are all available on our website, pepperwoodpreserve.org. You can also feel free to stay in touch with us by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or our YouTube channel. And with that, I don't see any other questions. Oop, looks like there was one question in the Q&A. Okay, what building materials are best for exterior walls and roofs?
So one of the, let me start first with the roof covering, because that tends to be perhaps the one that's attended to and perhaps even least understood as to the efficacy of almost all of our roof coverings, except for flammable wood. So probably if I were to recommend the least expensive and the most effective, and for many people, the least aesthetically pleasing, I would recommend composition shingles. These are the asphalt composition shingles that lay up very tightly. They don't allow firebrands to penetrate underneath to subsheathing or any of the underlayment materials. They indeed, if there is debris on the roof, like you saw in the demonstration video, they will be damaged and they'll have to be replaced. but they don't ignite, they don't spread fire, even with a penetration where a hole is burned in the roof and flames are coming out. They don't spread fire from that penetration point, and they don't decompose sufficiently with debris on top of them to get a penetration to the roof underlayment and potentially the roof sheathing, that subsheathing. So the bottom line is anything other than flammable wood, and we don't have a thatch problem in the US by and large, and so we can use virtually anything other than flammable wood. Now, what about tile of some sort? Particularly, let me use a worst case example of the Spanish tile, the half pipe kind of tile. And the problem with that is that it can't be laid out without gaps, typically. It's more difficult to close gaps that would allow firebrands into the underneath that roof covering. And frequently tile is laid over open furring, over purlins, because I mean, traditionally Spanish tile is for ventilation. You don't need vents if you've got the traditional Spanish tile. And yet what that does is it just allows firebrands either to get under the tile to whatever the underlayment is, or it goes into the attic. Now, the firebrand problem, the penetration problem of burning embers is, do they accumulate somewhere where they can produce a sustained ignition? So one of the things that we can do, and I just found out fairly recently that California 7A Wildland Urban Fire Code has eliminated mesh screening as being a possibility. You can confirm that if I heard that wrong. But it's not necessarily about just blocking the burning ember. It's about not having a sufficient ember to get in and generate a sustained ignition. Well, what if you've got an R50 blown in insulation in your attic that covers all the flammable surfaces, at which point your embers aren't going to land on flammable surfaces or surfaces where sustained ignition can occur. So we need to start thinking in terms of how the ignitions occur and what would produce that sustained ignition. So that leads me to what kind of wall materials? Well, if we don't have very close proximity of other houses, and just as a rule of thumb, so we've got overlapping home ignition zones. If we have single-story houses that are roughly 30 feet apart, so we'll just, say that it's symmetrical and it's a 15-foot setback from our property line, by and large, it's been our experience that we don't get significant structure-to-structure spread from flames. If there's a burning house next door, the burning embers coming out of that burning house are indeed going to cross over any of our property line to the house next door. But in terms of burning embers, or I mean in terms of flames, we largely don't get structure-to-structure spread at that distance. So we can have wood walls. Probably the least vulnerable is a wood wall, unless it's shingles where we can get burning embers potentially to lodge into the shingle gaps. Where we have problems with wood walls is at junctions with the surface of the ground where we've got burning material. That's the reason we have a 5-foot gap of a non-igniting zone. That doesn't mean no vegetation. It means that the vegetation that we have there is green, it's alive, it's well watered, and there's no dead material on the surface of that 5 feet under that vegetation or in that vegetation. Okay. So what we don't want to have is flame contact on that wood wall, or where that wood wall comes down to a deck of a wood deck, where we can get a pile of burning embers to accumulate and start initially a glowing combustion and then smoldering in that advantageous geometry. What I mean by that, first of all, we're starting with an inside corner along here, and then we have parallel surfaces where we've got wood parallel to wood where we can sustain that ignition. So it's not unusual in these incidents where we get a house that appears to be not ignited to become heavily involved several hours after a potential exposure from the sustained ignition in these locations. Well, how do we deal with that? Well, get rid of the inside corner, get rid of that flammable inside corner. How do we do that? Well, we can, if it's ledger board, meaning that the joist material that's supporting the deck is actually fastened to the side of the house, we can begin to separate that. And because we don't want water damage, we put metal flashing. Then in that inside corner, we cut back the first wood plank or even composition, plastic composition, and we make sure that there's a reveal where we've got a metal surface on the vertical side. So if we do get an accumulation of burning embers, it's on metal and it won't ignite. Same goes for a cedar chimney chase on our roof, where we get burning embers to accumulate. And if it's within a relatively dense development, we can get pieces of subsheathing in the house that is 100 feet away that's blown up and lands on our composition shingle roof, where it doesn't ignite, but it's up against that cedar sided chimney chase that comes right down to the surface of the roof. Well, so how do we deal with that? Well, we just cut a reveal. And we can do this retrofit. Carpenters should be able to do this, where we cut a reveal and then put the flashing up underneath to prevent water damage down under the shingles or to the shingles. And that eliminates that flammable inside corner. Those are two examples. Now, what about with high density development? And now we've got close proximity of houses where the house next door have flammable siding and they've got lots of window space. And now we get, depending on how the house has ignited and how the fire is spreading to that location where it can expose our wood wall, what can we do about that, where we're going to have radiant heating and potentially even flame contact in that gap? Well, we can use fiber cement. A brand name is Hardy Plank, and it is a non-combusting material. It's readily available. I recommend that you have somebody install it that's done it before, but you can use that on the outside, non-flammable. And they also now sell the same material with different surfaces for facing material, the trim boards, as well as planks for boxing your eaves to prevent flame from contacting under the wood eave. I don't recommend not having any eaves. Why? Because we still have it rain and water damage is still an issue. So as I somewhat sarcastically say or sardonically say to audiences, we certainly don't want your house to rot down before it has a chance to burn down. So what we want to do, and in many cases, we get a multiple benefit of fire resistance that also is accompanied by water resistance.
That was a lot of information, Jack, and maybe you could write that the material that you recommended by the name brand in the chat so that folks could find it a little bit easier. There are some questions here regarding materials, since we're talking about materials. So I'll give you a couple questions at once. So someone wants to know composite over metal roofs and vents, any vent changes. And then someone else wanted to know if you have any advice for a sort of a roof blower that can reach remote leaves, like something clever where they can get to leaves that are up high on a roof.
You know, I'm not sure I've got any quick and dirty kinds of ways of getting rid of debris other than using that leaf blower. Frequently, that means you have to get on your roof or hire somebody to get up on your roof. The one thing you need to be careful about with a leaf blower is not blowing your shingles off with the leaf blower. We've got leaf blowers these days that actually can do some damage, but given that we can use it responsibly and effectively, we can blow leaves out of our leaves and needles out of our gutters and off of our roof, accumulating up against wood vertical surfaces. By the way, when I mentioned the chimney chase, we have the same problem with offset complex roof designs, where we have one part of the roof coming in to a vertical wall. I mean, that's the same as basically being on the ground, except that it's on an incline of our roof pitch. Well, so the question that I remember is the last one. And the bottom line is we can do a great deal of debris removal with a leaf blower, modifying the velocity for the particular situation. We might use a full velocity on the ground, getting material away from our wood wall and far away, 5 feet plus away, maybe a high intensity for blowing leaves out of the gutters, because then we can blow it down the lapping of the roofing material, and then being a little bit modified in terms of the velocity for getting rid of debris if we're blowing up the layment of the roof.
Yeah, the other two questions had to do with, let's see, the roofing material composite versus metal. And then there was another question about vents.
So the deal about vents is to the best of your ability, to the best of what you have on your house, or if you're building a house, I recommend having the vents the least exposed as possible. So let me give you an example. A gable vent is in the end of that vertical gable end on a house. That vent is highly exposed to horizontal blowing of burning embers. So the embers are going to come roughly in the wind stream if that gable vent is exposed, and stick into so it typically louvered on the outside, and then it has to have roughly an 1/8 inch mesh metal screen on the inside that louvering. And what happens then is burning embers get up through the louvers easily and then stick and accumulate frequently to the screen or accumulate down at the base. So that base has to be non-flammable as well. Okay, that is one of the most exposed vents that we have for an attic. Same thing goes for example, if we've got a crawl space and one side of our house is, let's say there is a crawl space or a semi kind of open area under the house that's on the order of several feet of depth, and we can get embers blowing in to those vents. We need to make sure that where the accumulation of brands are is non-flammable, and that the mesh on the screen is 1/8 of an inch. Okay, if you're building a house, my recollection from just learning fairly recently is you don't worry about mesh because they've largely declined having mesh screens. Now it's going to be a special, if you're in a designated wildland urban area, it's designated as being some kind of a trap kind of vent. Brandguard and Vulcan are two manufacturers that have been named. Okay, so what would be an appropriate, relatively low exposure vent that is very common? Well, it's the eave vent, which requires eave boxing, and it's typically a strip vent that's louvered on, and the louver openings are on the order of about 1/8 of an inch. And then typically that's accompanied by either an off-ridge kind of vent that is sort of looking like pillows on our roof, or commonly it's going to be a ridge vent that we need to make sure is screened, such that when the embers go up and inside the vent, no ember accumulation occurs on flammable materials. So that screening has to be on top of any subsheathing or rafter material, not under it. And too frequently, it's way easier to put it under that material than it is over that material when the roof is during construction. But having screening on top of all the flammable roof material, the structure material, and those eave vents is a very, very resistant ember exposure.
All right, so we've got a couple sort of politically charged, potentially, questions here for you. The first one is, do you have any website recommendations for specific actions to take in your local home owners association?
So, my standard response to that is to look at other than perhaps your local California Fire Safe Council information, but from a national website standpoint, I suggest going to firewise.org and looking at what they have. That's the National Fire Protection Association website. And there is a certain degree of information also at the IBHS, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, the IBHS website as well. Those are the two that I recommend.
Great, thank you. There's another question about home ignition zones. What do you see as the biggest political or social challenge to the home ignition zones?
Society listening.
That was quick. Okay.
Well, let me be a little bit more serious with that question. It seems to me, after trying to communicate this for over 30 years, that our biggest problem is perceptional with regard to how the disasters occur, both from a tactical resolution as well as a strategic resolution. So what I'm talking about in that regard is we have this perception, as I suggested at the beginning of the presentation, that it's a wildfire problem and that it's a big flame problem. So the big flames are associated with the destruction because, number one, no suppression is really effective in that regard. And number two, the exposure that occurs from that can be long distance and significant with regard to burning embers. Okay. So our perception is that if we can't control the wildfire because it's a wildfire problem, that there's nothing else that we can do. And we've frequently heard example of after a paradise destruction from the campfire, we've heard firefighters in great frustration and ineffectiveness say, well, there's nothing that could have been done. And that statement is not a holistic statement. It's not comprehensive of everything that we can do. It is most accurate. It is most reasonable with regard to know for the conditions of the wildfire, for the conditions of the community, the vulnerability of the community. There was nothing in that case that as firefighters we could do to prevent that disaster. But is there nothing that we can do? Well, no. I mean, so it's been a long time since before 2018 that I was in Paradise. But when I was in Paradise previously, the last time, community, I mean, they called it Paradise, I guess, for a reason, because I was doing training of classes in Chico, right? So, and this was June. And so there's quite a difference in that 1,800 feet between Chico and Paradise. Number one, there were trees in Paradise over all the houses. But along with all those trees, by the way of which a significant amount were hardwoods that didn't burn, didn't have fire spread through any of the canopy, they dropped litter. And my experience, both from colleagues that I had who had relatives in Paradise, was that the litter on and between houses was significant. It was significant that they told me it was the last time I was there. And so what we're talking about is a vulnerability that would be readily mitigated, readily modified if we viewed the problem as a community problem that could be readily dealt with in regard to the ignition vulnerability of that community within the community. And I want to emphasize, when we think fuel treatment, I mean, right now, in order to protect communities as a society, we tend to think, oh, fuel treatment, we're going to modify the wildland fuels to somehow make ourselves more effective preventing an exposure in the community. And when I think fuel treatment with regard to the community, specifically to the community, I think about, well, where in the world is a fuel treatment most effective? Well, within the fuel treatment. So if I'm on a wildland situation, the fuel treatment is maybe where I want to go to. For example, if I'm doing prescribed burning, I'm going to use the fuel treatment as perhaps an ignition point or a holding point. So let's consider the fuel of a community disaster being the community. Where do we want to do the fuel treatment? In the community fuel, where it can be most effective.
Yeah, that ties into a question that was just asked regarding whether you think forest thinning and pile burning is a good use of community resources. And it sounds like what you're saying is it's a both and. You want to do that so that it doesn't become like maybe a crown fire, a really extreme you know, fire that spreads easily in the wildland close to the community. And then also you want to consider the fuels reduction within the community itself. So redefining fuel, really.
Yeah,
In the community.
and in this discussion, what we can do now with this discussion is begin to think about the community physically separate. We have the ability, the opportunity to physically, from a wildfire ignition vulnerability standpoint, we can separate it from that wildfire regardless of how that wildfire burns. Now, in this discussion, when I say that, we're in jeopardy of ignoring the problems, by the way, that last way longer than the length of time that it takes to rebuild a community. That's a rather crass statement, but I want to contrast the two problems that we have, the two very real problems we have with wildfire. One being the community, how we take care of that. But now, at the beginning of the presentation, I wanted to put a essentially stake in the ground regarding the problem we have with wildland fire occurrence in our wildlands. Because what we're currently doing is having fuel treatment in our wildlands via severe wildfire. And that is the extent of that occurring now is very atypical of the kind of fire that we had most of the time in the development and maintenance of our ecosystems historically for thousands of years. Indigenous peoples, the culture of Native Americans knows that. If we consult fire as a cultural practice before European settlement, we find out that Native Americans, indigenous peoples, were quite capable of not only living with fire on our landscapes. I mean, think about this. A fire is ignited, nobody's out there dropping retardant on it, and there was not the technology nor the staffing to be able to go out and try to suppress landscape fire. Basically, fires were ignited and then they burned. Well, so if we look at the conditions that mostly occur that will support fire spread, we find out that those conditions tend to be moderate, not severe, they're moderate, which means that if we're lighting fires all the time as people, then most of that fire occurrence is going to be during moderate conditions that produce way different results, both in terms of regeneration as well as the consumption of organic material. The kinds of situations we have today with smoke burning for weeks behind where the fire front once occurred it's burning all of the organic material, not only in terms of tree canopies and shrubs, it's burning all the litter, the duff, down to the mineral soil. That is not common in our natural history.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I wanted to point out to folks that are here local in Sonoma County, there is a Fire Forward program here that's run by the Audubon Canyon Ranch, and they do a lot of prescribed burning and pile burning to help to reduce those fuels and educating people about fighting fire with fire. So check that out with Audubon Canyon Ranch. They're one of our sister organizations. There's another, we'll get to two more questions. So
let me just make a connection here.
Yeah.
And this essentially gets to how it is that I got involved in this wildland urban fire issue anyway. So now we have a situation where we are so focused on the natural hazard of wildfire on our communities that we have enhanced. As I indicated in the presentation, I want to reinforce and emphasize the fact that we are now largely trying to build capacity for more fire suppression, for more atypical fire occurrence. We don't eliminate fire, we merely postpone it to conditions ever more severe that overwhelm us, which means that if we can physically get our communities from burning during wildland fire, and we can psychologically understand that we can get those communities separated from wildland fire, that liberates us now to not being so averse to having wildland fire burning at landscape levels, which is a long time period over large scales, which means we don't do controlled burning at landscape scales. I don't care what we call it. As a former lighting supervisor and fire behavior analyst, once I've got a fire at landscape scale, both in terms of the area plus how long it takes to be burning at those scales, I don't have fire control. I may have appropriate fire occurrence. I may be doing it under prescribed conditions, but I don't have control. Control is a delusion. And so the bottom line is, we fundamentally, intuitively understand that as firefighters. So we see this fire out there with the occurrence down beyond our weather forecast, becoming severe and burning up a community. And so we don't do it. So if we can get our communities separated physically and psychologically, prospectively out of being disastrously affected by wildland fire, now it frees us up to have more appropriate fire on our landscapes under not the severe conditions over wide areas. I mean, when we look at Dixie and Calder, those are unmitigated disasters. And I'm not suggesting that every acre of those fires are necessarily taking out the tree canopy, but those fires are burning under conditions where a huge amount of organic material that wouldn't otherwise be consumed is burning on the essentially above our mineral soil. Okay.
Yeah, it's I mean, this is not a question that someone asked, but I'm curious. Do you get the sense that, and maybe it's okay if you don't answer this, but do you get a sense that there is a shift in the management practices of folks when it comes to landscape fire on natural lands where there maybe isn't a community there? Like, for example, what's happening in Northern California right now, in the Trinity Alps area. You know, do you get a sense that folks are deciding to put their resources in other areas and just letting it burn in the, forest areas?
Well, we tend to do that more when we're maxed out on resources, because now we're forced into the situation of, well, what is more threatening? The fire in the Trinity Alps or Calder, which is burned across the southern part, just south of South Lake Tahoe. And so all of a sudden that becomes low priority. I mean, being on incident management teams, that would be exactly what I would be doing if I had any if I was in a geographic area command. That is exactly what I would be doing with regard to maxing out on my resources. But that's all tactics. That's not a strategy. That's just a tactical reaction. And so what I'm not seeing is the elimination of the leadership letters that are coming across the email saying, well, we're in a full suppression mode this year because climate change or severe conditions or drought or whatever. Like, I mean, indeed, climate change is increasing the severity of our droughts, both in terms of the length of time as well as the severity of the drought. Okay, so the last thing in the world that we want to do in this kind of rapidly changing environment is stand in the way of adaptability. And that's by and large what we're doing with fire suppression. Having the fire occurrence over extended areas under the most severe conditions. Not only that, but we also need to recognize, and my colleague Jennifer Balch wrote a paper that has been repeatedly quoted regarding 80% of our wildfire ignitions are from humans. Yeah, well, so what has changed in that regard? There's a fire ecologist at, I believe, the Utah State University wrote a paper in 2006. His name's Charles Kay. And the title of his paper was, "Is lightning unnatural as an igniter of wildfire?" Is something like that. I never remember titles. But the bottom line is, people have always been a major igniter, a major cause of wildfires. And so we have this sense of focusing on a cause instead of a result, when in fact human cause has always been a high level cause of ignitions of wildland fire across our landscapes for thousands of years.
You bring up some amazing points. I think there's been some wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your fresh perspectives and your years and years of dedication to this particular topic. And I will end this with one last question. I think I wanted to, it had to do with the Ember cast distance and the likelihood of ignition percentages. Do you have any links or information that would give a little bit more context to the Ember cast distance?
Yeah. What we can, given extreme fire behavior conditions, we can assume, depending on what the vegetation is, because we can have extreme wildfire behavior in grass, right? And so the grass material, even heavy grasses, the spotting distance from heavy grasses is quite short, primarily because, number one, we don't have extended heights where the buoyancy is accelerating those hot flames to the point. Let me give you an example. If we've got a tree that's on the order of 50 feet tall, and we did this in Northwest Territories, we actually measured this. What is the velocity of the flame plume at the top of the tree? And we were measuring on the order of about 70 miles an hour. Okay, 70 to 75 miles an hour, which is capable of stripping branches off the tree as it's burning. So we get considerably different burning embers in that regard than what we get in grasses, where maybe the grass is 3 feet tall, or maybe it's reeds. I mean, sawgrass we see in South Florida is a coarse grass, and we see it a little further distance. But then we have to have the winds to blow it downrange. So what we see is, as we get to more and more substantial woody material as being the source of the burning ember, and the height of that canopy that burns, and the velocity of the wind above that plume that transports it downwind, in, for example, chaparral and particularly in complex terrain where we've got high intensity chaparral canopy burning at 1,000 feet above us up on this ridge, we should expect a half a mile or more for burning embers that can last long enough to ignite in a receptive landing spot. Okay, so the bottom line here is we don't know what the percentage is because we don't know how many burning embers there are, and we don't know specific conditions. However, that's not the issue. The issue is what can we expect during these extreme conditions? And in any woody vegetation with strong winds, we should expect at least a quarter to a half a mile where we get burning ember ignitions initiated.
All right, well, that's a lot to take in. That was a lot of information. If folks want to rewatch this again, I know I probably will rewatch it as well with some friends and family. This will be available on our YouTube channel later this week, Pepperwood Foundation. And I want to give a huge thank you to you, Jack, for an incredible presentation. And there was a lot of information there, including fire ecology as well as home hardening. And I know I personally learned a lot, and I have some notes for my own house and how I want to home harden it a little bit, considering what you talked about today. So a big thank you to you, and thanks to everyone who came with us today to this presentation. And please join us again for another upcoming webinar or class at Pepperwood. And in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate your interest. Bye now.